first question. Gentleman at the front, name and organisation.
David Shipley, currently in the process of setting up a think tank looking at this sort of issue around extremism. You seem to be describing attempts to reform and almost anglicise, if I can put it that way, British Islam. And you said you thought that could be quite easily done. Would you mind just expanding a bit on some different approaches that you think might deliver that?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, if you're looking for a think tank, I'm available. I'm unemployed at the moment. I'm joking.
Restrictive practices here, Mac.
Okay, yeah.
No sharing.
No sharing. Okay, of course. I do think, and you get a lot of this, which isn't surfaced or isn't put together in a way that expresses itself, where I talk about this, my own phrase about modern Islam, modern Muslims, and there's a lot of modern Muslims around, more so than we perhaps understand, and they are the perfect example of how Islam, Britain, our values can work and live together. So you can enjoy a professional life, you can, as I said, go to the theatre, go on holiday, do all those things, but also be recognised and valued as somebody who holds a religion dear and be pious. But we just haven't shone a light enough on those elements, and it does fill me with regret, because I meet these people, I sit on mosque floors with them, and they're very sensible, articulate people. They range from some top professionals through to maybe those people who are driving taxis at the moment, but nevertheless very anglicised, very British, and extremely Muslim. So it can be done. We just need to reach them.
Thank you. Lady there, name and organisation.
My name's Victoria. Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm a consultant and I work with the UAE Embassy in the UK. One of the areas that you touched on was about the narrative. And particularly in the last few days, we've seen how there is a certain group of Muslims who perhaps espouse some of the less tolerant views, who work very effectively in their narrative together at rounding on individuals like yourself to denounce you. And this seems to be a fairly common occurrence. People like Sarah Khan suffer the same sort of thing. So in an ideal world, what would you need for the sort of moderate, modern Muslim voice to conquer that narrative and dominate the space against your opponents?
Well, I think what that space needs is very strong Muslim leadership by a range of people, preferably women in particular. I think we can do that. I think there needs to be a very robust rebuttal upon their claims, and without picking on Dame Louise Casey again. But instead of looking at some of the outcomes and what was being said, there was criticism about, well, actually the analytical research methods, which took us down a line which was distorting of what we should be dealing with. And they do that all the time. They do that with Prevent, they do that with me, they do that with, I mean, if I may give you one example where I said, actually one way to make us resistance to radicalisation and extremism is if everyone within their own home, within their private space, would become more vigilant. So if your child comes home from school and is behaving slightly differently, maybe not engaging, bit quiet, bit offish, I would speak to my child, and maybe it's bullying, maybe it's an off day, maybe not well, maybe falling out with best friends, maybe. Or maybe that child comes back and says, actually, I'm not going to shop at Marks and Spencer's anymore. And I say, well, why is that? And they said, well, service not good, it's too far, it's too expensive, the woman was rude. Or why if my child turned around to me and said, well, actually, it's Zionists, those are the people killing Muslims. And that's what gets said. And what I said was, actually, you have a duty to talk to your child, to engage, explain, educate, intervene, all of those things. And you can help explain those things. And what I got back, the fierce amount of attack that I got back was, and the headlines were carried, Mak Chishty says, if you shop at Marks and Spencer's, you are a terrorist. And that's what was said. That's what was said. Now, there's a real serious point to this, because actually I'm making a very serious point about safeguarding. It could be child exploitation, could be grooming, could be bullying, could be intimidation, could be anything, joining a gang, could be sexual abuse. Making a very, very serious point here. and they ridicule it in a way. And what amazes me is how many people take that off and think, oh yeah, if this is what this guy's saying, it's not. So I think it needs a very strong presence, it needs a very coherent strategy, it needs bold and courageous people, and it needs some serious leadership, which I don't think we've got currently in the Muslim community. I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions at the back? Gentleman there at the back, yes.
Gavin McNichol, Eden Intelligence. I'm just wondering what sort of methodologies you think should be applied in your analysis for this mapping process. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, very, very briefly. I mean, you know, we need to do a proper assessment of that. But certainly, if you start to have a look at start with the religion of Islam denominationally. What are your origins? Where do you come from? What school do you come from? Is it very literalist or is it more liberal? Where do you come from? What part of the world do you come from? Because that will also inform its interpretation. Then you have a look at actually what your social framework is like. How do you live life? What does that make you into as well? And what that'll drive you into is actually, is somebody more amenable to the lure of extremist ideology as a true form of Islam or not? So if you take me, for example, Muslim, born Muslim, still am Muslim, very Sufi, very mystical. Some people think, that's not Islam at all, but I'm quite strong in my beliefs. So I'm perhaps less likely to get drawn into that, unless there's a vulnerability within me, where there's a grievance or I'm racked off with something, where I've had an incident where I think actually the state is against me. And when you get all of these driving forces, these push and pull factors in there, that can also twist your emotions. So when you get twisted emotions and you get that background coming together, that may suggest a driver which makes you amenable or more vulnerable to that notion. So it's multifactorial, there's a plethora of layers, but a lot of the information exists. I would also ask communities to maybe help them self-define where they come from, because a lot of them won't know, but they act in a way that is absolutely as part of that description. And once you start to hold those conversations, it might cause them to reflect as well. So it can be done. You can have a number of indices as your analytical points to build up that picture, and it'd be interesting to see what that is. At the moment, we do have red areas around the country where we know certain things or intelligence has pointed to maybe attack planning, but I'm talking at a much more sophisticated and community level now.
Gentleman at the front, name and organise.
Jeremy Thomas, an Anglo-German academic working with the German university system in Britain. You mentioned the question of moral standing.
Yes.
And perceptions of moral standing.
Mm-hmm.
How far do we need to try and set out some agreed common moral narrative around which our communities can cohere? Now, there is this inherited Anglo-Saxon liberal reluctance to avoid too close definition, to avoid setting things out into explicit principles. But one wonders whether such a narrative could not be could attempt to agree upon, based upon, for want of a better word, some Aristotelian conception of the good life, thinking of how Aristotle's thought formed a basis and foundation for many of the early Muslim philosophers, particularly after the Muslim conquest of Spain. And the parallel I would draw would be the proposal for what was called a pro-ethical, pro-eti syllabus, which was put forward for the Berlin school system. It wasn't adopted, but something like that has been well thought of, has been well regarded. And while we would not copy it directly, it might be an example we might draw upon in order to find some kind of moral narrative which all our communities might find it easier to relate to, and might enable us all to come more closely together than we might have done in the past.
I think the the process of doing that is probably more valuable than the actual outcome. So getting into that discussion where you're talking about common things that matter to me and you, being good neighbours, being good people, helping one another, a bit like what the Syrian community want asking me to do. So arriving at that destination is a process that's more important and more valuable than once you get to the destination, whether it's a charter, social charter, or a set of standard or agreed values, it matters less because we've already arrived there. But I think the principle you're making is a good one. The question that you asked is, do we need that? Well, we haven't got that at the moment, and we've perhaps got more division, and that division is perhaps becoming hardened within the middle ground, and we've seen the amount of anti-Muslim sentiment play out on social media as a result of those attacks. We are still in the aftermath of last year of Brexit. We had the eruption of some disorder with Black Lives Matters. So a number of things which are colliding and hitting against each other, rubbing against each other, which may find some reassurance from a common set of agreed ways of behaviour. So I think it's probably a good thing. Sorry.
Gentleman at the back, name and organisation. At the back on the right.
Hello, Nathan O'Leigh, the College of Policing. Max, slightly in-house, but I just wondered if from your experience, obviously in policing, whether there were particular things that policing needs to learn as well in this battle. And I'm thinking perhaps a bit more internally about in terms of recruitment, retention, and the ways of encouraging, helping the police to look more like the communities we serve, and obviously that being a major part of tackling extremism.
Well, I think, thank you, it's a good question. Couple of things first. Is to talk about the function, then the composure of policing. So the function is actually policing at the moment, the law enforcement approach around dealing with extremism is divided into two halves, I feel. So you've got countering terrorism, which is the contest strategy and the 4 Ps, and there's a draw towards the prevent, and that's countering extremism. It is not. On the other side of the house, what we have is a new counter-extremism strategy, which is far broader. It's about going upstream. It requires a different set of skills. But more importantly from the police, what it requires is understanding what that means. Understanding it requires space and it requires utility and resource to do that. That just doesn't happen. And as local officers who are known, familiar and trusted in local neighbourhoods, that's a good starting place, but it has to be done in partnerships. Okay? In terms of capability, what needs to be done? Well, I'd like my mother-in-law, who's got to be about 70 now, to become a special constable. I like her friends who go to the prayer groups together and they meet every week, and if there's an ill child in the neighbourhood, they'll raise some money or they'll have a prayer session saying, God, please alleviate the suffering of this child and make him or her better. They've got their networks. Okay? She may not look great in a police uniform, but what would look great, I wish I hadn't said that.
We'll delete it from the video that we're putting out afterwards.
Either that or don't show my wife. Yeah. But what would look great is actually in the heart, in that intimate space of that neighbourhood, in that home, in that environment, somebody saying, I'm a special constable. And what that means is I'm part of the institution. I have a warrant card. I have some powers. But more importantly, I'm not going to run around chasing burglars, but what I am going to do is make sure that we all feel safe. So because I've been talking a lot about actually over the last couple of days, because I've been asked questions on cuts as well, believe it or not. It's not my area of expertise, but actually how we've made lots of savings, but at the same time the mission has grown. So you've got a divergent approach and some thought around that. So we're not saying it's an endless pot, and I understand that, but what you have got is you've got different elements which haven't been exhausted. And it just requires us as a service to get over ourselves a little bit and say, actually, we can do things in a different way. And one of those ways would be good. But thank you for the question.
Lady there on the far side on the wall. Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting
name and organisation.
talk. Oh, sorry. Emily Dyer, Ministry of Justice. You mentioned something about prevent earlier, and that there are things you think could improve about prevent, but you think it should stay and it serves a valuable purpose. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what you think works and what you think could be improved on?
Well, I think 20 to 25% of prevent referrals are actually to do with far right. So there's a message there saying actually all about Muslim focus. It's not. And I've had Muslim people come up to me, and white families have gone to them and saying, thank God for prevent. And real case stories, not from London, from around the country, and I've received those. But they don't seem to be exhibited in a way that's helpful. So we need to do something about that. I think that as a case management process, similar to safeguarding, I think we've become pretty good at safeguarding, not perfect, but we get the right people around the room, we have a case management conference, we put somebody in charge, we have referral notes, and we take it through the process. Whether protecting somebody from child abuse or vulnerabilities from their parents or loved ones, or whether it's radicalisation, we're pretty good at that. I think there's three things that we haven't done as well, if I'm honest with you. I don't think that when we talked about prevent, we did it in a way that we reached communities to assure or reassure them that this was a safe and helpful thing to do, where they could come on board. It was almost instructive, because I was there some of the time. It was instructive, and you've got to engage at an emotional level to win people over. It's a bit like the duty to prevent, and it's some great hooks that we've got, some great instruments of the law we've got. But unless the community engage in that, then no referrals are going to come forward, and it's going to be a one-sided affair. So you have to get that engagement and get them to mesh together. Number two, I really do think that people are worried about the stigma thing, and I think we can reassure them of that. And number three, it's not a random selection, and nobody can make a prevent referral lightly. In fact, it takes confidence by teachers, by social workers, by nurses, by doctors, by police officers. I think we could do more to build understanding and capability in how we do that, and maybe show people what our thinking process is, and maybe get the public. One thing that I've done, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, is I've involved in the public in a lot more of my day-to-day work, a lot more, and you may have seen me on TV or some of the issues that I deal with. It's a lot of it's with the public, and they produce some really good ideas. If I just may mention one, we had the threat of the far right wanting to draw cartoons of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, outside every town hall. I thought, how do you get away with this? Because it could be uproar, it could be, riots if this happens in the country. And one guy came up to me who works with me, he's a member of the community. He said, listen, Mac, he said, at the end of the Prophet himself endured far worse in his lifetime than just cartoons. Let them crack on with it. So I studied that. So I said, and what happened is the whole Muslim community, the fury died towards it and said, our Prophet probably worse than that. We'll take the example. And what happened was nobody really came out to draw. So the point I'm making, we can involve the community at a far greater than we are at the moment, and maybe a message for the college as well.
Thank you. Sorry, lady there, name and organisation.
Productions. Just regarding prevent, Karam Butt had extreme tendencies, and actually a friend of his called up the police and said, I have somebody who has very extreme views. He was actually on a Channel 4, as we all know, documentary. Obviously, it's very difficult legally to do something. Yeah. But why hasn't the system hasn't it worked better in order to prevent somebody who was in real danger to commit something, or be within a community was ready to commit crimes?
Okay, that's subject to review, and one thing I think the police service is really good at is reviewing and being open about that. But there is a threshold issue here, which I wouldn't particularly want to raise, because it just means an infringement on our civil liberties a bit more. So I've been outside mosques when we've had that type of people protesting, and really on the line of offence, but not quite breaking the law. And I know who these people are, because our office have taken details, we've searched them, we've perhaps locked them up in the past, and I know what they're saying, which is personally highly offensive, but not perhaps illegal. Yeah, but the point there is, if some of them then go on to doing something, but at the point that we knew what they were like, which we do, there's nothing to suggest that they were going to plan an attack. And then we face the legitimate questions that you asked. This is the right question about how do we deal with that. And I'm saying that there's going to be many questions like that, because we cannot I think there's 3,000 people that we're looking at, 20,000 perhaps on the interest list. We cannot do that. So what do we do? And this is where I'm saying push it back into upstream and start communities and us dealing with it in a honest way, as opposed to, oh my God, you're going to profile us, and oh my God, you're upsetting me. And I'm sorry if we are, but security and safety is now become a real issue to us because we've had a lot of people killed. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a lot of further questions. Gentleman at the front has been waiting patiently. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you. My name is George Chiesa. I'm absolutely independent and individual. I'm part of the 0%, 3.5 million people who don't vote in this country but pay taxes and obey the law. I'm Italian. In the law here, we have an article 127 of the Communications Act that says that your freedom of expression is fine, but if you propagate lies with the purpose of create unnecessary anxiety, etc., 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 which in other words is create the conditions for radicalization, then you have a nice fine or jail. And the only people that are prosecuted under Section 127 are the people who post obscene messages, pictures of dead bodies, or do false 999 calls. But we are creating an environment in which the population don't trust 90% of what they said, or worse, is gullible and trusts things that are obviously false. So with the broken window strategy of New York, can we take a bit of the clutter and make sure that people can express opinions, but that people don't spread false facts? Because false facts tend to radicalization more than opinions.
I think what you're saying is hold people more to account and make them more responsible.
Hold people to account that if they express their opinion, they tag that as their opinion. There are many cases where people express facts that are patently false.
Okay.
And
Right,
they are only used to radicalize and to get people angry about things. We're creating the conditions for that.
I think you're right. I was watching the news that was breaking. I think it was January last year where some explosions were taking place in Belgium with the Molenbeek. And as the news was flashing on Sky TV, I was picking up communication that this was all a conspiracy by the European police to deal with the refugee crisis. And people believe that. And it's that instant. But that plays into the point that this is real and it needs to be, yeah. No, nobody's prosecuted for that now. But when it gets from word of mouth and starts getting communities, and communities do believe that, you can see how difficult the challenge is. But I agree.
A lot more questions. Maybe we take the last few as a clutch and you answer them as a group, if you don't mind. Sorry. Lady there in the middle, a gentleman there in the same row next to Dame Louise. Yes, you.
Hi, Glenna Scilio, member of staff for Ben Wallace. You spoke a great deal about this idea of resentment in Muslim communities, especially among the younger generation. And I was just curious, how do you think that Brexit will impact this sort of idea of resentment in these communities? And how do you think the state can combat this in such a transitional time in the country? Thank you.
Gentleman there next to you.
Paul Cole of the Royal Air Force. We saw in Northern Ireland sectarian terrorism lived in the deprived poor areas. And I bet if you do your mapping, it's going to show the same with Islamic terrorism. We've spoken about the Muslim community needing to move towards the state. We've talked about policing, and secret intelligence agencies will be part of that. Do we need a social policy conversation as well? Something along the lines of an economic development council, shades of Hazeltine in the 80s.
One more question. Do I see any more people asking? Lady there. Yes, you. Name and organisation, please.
Dawn Friedman, retired circuit judge. You mentioned there should be a regulatory framework for what is said in mosques. And given that you've said there are 16 different sects of Muslim communities and 4 schools of thought, who would be responsible for creating that framework? And would it not be possible within the Muslim community itself to have a strong body who could voice a condemnation of extremist thought and distorted narrative?
Okay, great.
Thank you. Do you want to take
one good answer?
Yeah, one silver bullet that answers all of them in one.
You're probably thinking, the first one I've given so far. Okay, I don't think Brexit is related to extremism. However, we've got to understand that Brexit, I think, has hardened the centre ground. So it's not more extremists being more extremists on the right wing. It's been a hardening and a more intolerant feature of our country, which has come out in Manchester, which has come out in London Bridge, and parts of that were applauded by some people on social media when we had the attack on Finsbury Park, which means the mood is far more acrimonious and fragile, and we've got to take account of that, because I don't want our community to become fractured. Social development policy, I think, having spoken to a number of councils up and down the country and understood where they're coming from, and somebody's from here from DCLG? DCLG? Yeah, thank you, we met in the lift. Probably not going to be very complimentary, but there needs to be some uplifting of understanding and skills, because sometimes just the way my experience from what I've understood is, just the way that the policies are made and then carried out alienate people, and we can show greater understanding, and it's not hard to do. There was a chap called Asad Shah who was killed in Glasgow 18 months ago. He was an Ahmadiyya Muslim. He was killed by a guy from Bradford who travelled up to kill him, and he was killed at that time because they thought he was killed because of his belief system was Ahmadiyyan, and the wider Muslim community do not think Ahmadiyyans or suggest they're Muslims. Murder is murder. That was a crime. He was a criminal. I did not want him to be heralded as a religious martyr. He was a murderer in our country. So we tried to disquiet any voices and set the standards. But what we did do, we created, and it was at Scotland Yard, across the country, we got all 16 denominations together across the whole sectarian dimension. And we all came together, all condemned that as a murder, all condemned sectarianism, and all stood up for the Ahmadiyya Muslim communities as a strong community together. So the reason I'm saying that is it can be done. It can be done. There's no reason why you can't get people in the same room. If they understand you, if you understand them and they trust you, you can do it. And ultimately what we were saying was, I wasn't asking anybody to deceive their own values or their principles or go against the religion. All I was saying was do the right thing. And they did it. Thank you.
Thank you.